Hello friends! So, reading better does not necessarily mean reading more. It means getting more from the reading experience, having a richer relationship to specific types of books or storytelling. Reading better really means that the list of books you consider to be your all-time favorites gets longer almost every time you read. You are able to gain something from most, if not all, of the books that you read, even the bad ones. That is really enriching your reading experience. And when you're a writer, reading better means allowing yourself to still get immersed in other people's stories without constantly feeling like you're analyzing them to the point where you can no longer enjoy reading other people's stories, since you're either annoyed by common tropes or you're constantly comparing yourself to every writer that you read, and then you just find yourself coming up short, and so you start avoiding reading altogether. Essentially, in this video, I would like to give you some tips on how to improve your overall reading experience so that it is richer and also, more importantly, more enjoyable. That is the main goal. So, tip number 1, don't analyze while you're reading. Now that may seem like a contradiction that negates everything I just said, but when you are immersed in a book, just let yourself be immersed. That's what reading is for. It's the whole purpose of reading. It's also the goal of every writer. Their ultimate dream is that someone will pick up their book and read it and be completely immersed. So let that happen. Don't try to think like a writer while you're reading and get your little analytical brain on. You don't even need to be trying to learn. You just need to have your enjoying brain on. And then you can save all the analyzing for after you've put down the book. Unless you hit a snag. Which brings me to tip number 2. Take note of every time you lose immersion in the story. You can dog ear, underline, or put a sticky note. Use anything you can to mark the spot where you noticed that you wanted to put the book down, because it was suddenly more interesting to go get a snack, or watch TV, or take a walk, or anything else besides reading. And on a side note, because I can feel all of the daggers hitting my face from all the anti-book desecrationists out there, it is my belief that as long as the book belongs to you, and it is not some rare sacred copy, you can write all over it. As a writer myself, my personal dream is that someone loves my book so much that their copy is dog-eared and full of scribbles in the margins and all these passages are underlined. To me, the art is in the words, not necessarily in the physical copy. And I believe that adding your thoughts to the margins of your book adds to the book rather than degrading it. That's just my opinion. Anyway, I use a notebook for this so that it's easier for me to sort my thoughts into different categories. But you could also use different colored sticky notes to mark different types of thoughts, either positive or negative places in the story when you encounter them. So, jot down any place you want to skim or skip, and that's all. For now, while you're reading, that's all you need to do. Just notice, and put a little reminder there for you to return to after you've finished the book. And by finish, I mean you actually read the whole thing, or you get to a point where you decide you really just don't care what happens in the book. And that's fine too. Either way, that's the point where you have finished the book, and your writerly analysis can begin. But when you're still immersed in the reading and aren't ready to be thinking analytically yet, tip number 3 is to try to still take note of specific lines or moments that move you. Again, either by placing a different colored sticky note, or by creating a different list in your notebook, or even just simply tagging the page so you can sort through positive and negative experiences later. It does not matter, just notice. It's important to notice these things even when you are reading a genre that you have no intention of ever writing. For example, if you are reading a piece of contemporary literary fiction and you strictly write epic fantasy, you can still learn from that story and use what you learn in your own writing. So, maybe the literary fiction that you are reading has particularly beautiful metaphors, or it handles the passage of time in a unique and startling way. You, as an epic fantasy writer, might really benefit from examining how that author achieved those things, so that you can carry that into your own writing. It works the other way around, too. So, if you only write very serious contemporary literary fiction, this technique of noticing moments sparks something in you still matters when you're reading something that you might consider to be just straight fun or fluff. Maybe you're reading a sugary sweet romance, and you take note of how the author uses facial expression to convey affection. Or they focus on the shape of characters' hands at specific unexpected moments, and you notice it creates a feeling of warmth inside of you, or even longing. Use that in your writing. That will enhance your contemporary literary fiction. Tip number 4. Once you've finished a book, either by reading all the way to the end or deciding you never want to read all the way to the end, I like to take a big picture overview before I go back and read through all the notes I took while I was reading. Again, I like to write this all down in my notebook, but you could really just think it in your head if you wanted to. This isn't school. So I'll finish a book and then I'll think, was I disappointed by the ending? If so, why? How would I have written the ending differently? If I was not disappointed by the ending, I'll think, why wasn't I disappointed? Was the ending surprising and I couldn't predict the final twist? Or was it satisfying in that the ending tied back to something earlier in the story? Then think about what types of endings you like to write, what types of endings you might like to try to write, and how could you end your story in a similar way or in the opposite way that this story ends. You don't actually have to do the writing, but just think about it. What would happen if I ended my story in a similar manner as this story ends? What would happen if I ended my story in the opposite manner that this story ends? I like to think about the ending as soon as I've finished a book when the ending is still fresh in my mind, but I also like to take a few days to let the book rest in the back of my mind before really examining how I feel about it. Tip number 5. After a few days have passed, now is the time to sit down with your book and go through all the notes you took while you were reading. All the places you marked. Are there more places that I marked where I was bored or skimming or considering putting the book down? Or are there more places I marked where a certain line moved me, or I felt a spark of connection to the characters? That might help indicate whether or not this story is one that's going to have a lasting impact on you, but it might not. A story could have been full of really beautifully written lines that you love and want to think about, but it also could have been a story as a whole that didn't impact your life in any kind of memorable way. So, when I'm sitting with the book, first thing I like to think is, can I remember this book? Am I even still thinking about this book at all? Either good or bad. Is the story still in my mind? A lot of times when I read something, I realize a few days later that after I put the book down, I literally never thought about the book again. And that is not something that most writers want their readers to experience. If that is the case though, I sometimes try to think, what went wrong in this story? Why is this story so unmemorable? But sometimes I'm literally not even able to remember anything that happened in the story. The characters, the plot, anything. Until I actually start flipping through the pages of the story and my notes and being like, oh yeah, that's what this story was about. Usually the reason a book does not stick in a reader's mind, in my mind, in anyone's mind, is because the characters felt flat. That can be a personal opinion, but there are also craft reasons why a character could fall flat for a large number of readers. Usually it means that they read like characters and not like people. So if that happens, it's a good idea to go through the story and try to identify where the author went wrong with the characters. Read the initial character introductions, even if you hadn't marked them as a particularly memorable moment, and try to spot moments where the characters felt robotic or overly familiar, as if they were spotting old cliche movie lines rather than thinking actual human thoughts. If though, when you initially sat down with the book, you were still thinking about the book because you hated it, that's important to examine too. Why did you hate it? What specifically created the hate that you carried for the last few days? Was the author intending to create a polarizing story? Was the story uncomfortable for you because you identified too much with the villain rather than the protagonist? That can be an intentional tactic done by the author to create either a more thought-provoking story or a more memorable, fearsome villain, or both. And then it would be up to you as a writer in the future to decide if that's something you want to include in your novel. Or if you don't want your readers to identify overly much with the villain, at the risk of causing hate, that you try to avoid what this author did with their villain, so that your future readers don't go around just stewing after they read your book. Or maybe you hated the story because you felt like the story violated some essential storytelling rule that you hold to be true, like not killing off the main character halfway through. That has left you now feeling cheated, but it is also a personal opinion of yours, and the author could have intended that to be something polarizing that they included in their story. So, none of these things make a story bad necessarily, but when you're writing, you want your writing to be intentional. You don't want it to just be up to luck, whether or not your readers find your book polarizing or the villain overly villainous or memorable or relatable. You want all of these aspects of your story to be things that you intentionally put into the story. Either to create the sensation of uncomfortable familiarity with the villain, or a shocking violation of storytelling rules that you have intentionally broken, rather than accidentally broken, which might end up leading your story to feel muddy or weak. But either good or bad, these are all things that you can carry over into your own writing, that you pick up on when you're reading, no matter what you are reading.